In the mid to late 90s, Sony established themselves as a force to be reckoned with in the games industry. The PlayStation enticed countless third-party developers early on through its use of CD-ROMs, which were cheaper to license and boasted more space, full-motion video playback, and the console's speed and power made it an easy choice. The Nintendo 64 stuck with proprietary cartridges, which were more expensive to produce and had very limited space, and although the Saturn had its advantages, it had 2 processors and used quadrilaterals for generating polygons, rather than the industry standard of triangles. This all meant that the PlayStation dominated the 5th generation of consoles, and most importantly, it advanced video games as an art form, not only creating genre-defining works, but also further demonstrating what games were capable of portraying. Through narrative, atmosphere, acting, animation, level design, and game mechanics, the PlayStation was unlike any console that came before it. Now that PlayStation developers knew it was possible to create games like this, the next logical step would be to take things further, push political, social, and artistic boundaries, challenge preconceived notions of what games can be. Change the industry forever by establishing foundational games and by showing the uninitiated what this art form can really do. The PlayStation 2 shaped video games into what they are today. A lot of what games established in this generation would create industry phenomena that persist to this day, in all facets of game design. The technology enabled developers to convey convincing emotions, deliver earnest messages, and create experiences unlike anything the world had ever seen, and it went on to become the best-selling console of all time at 160 million units sold. And all the while, it is home to over 10,000 games. I only own a mere 1% of the total library. Granted, I own some of its games on other platforms, but that is how positively gargantuan the PS2 library truly is. You can discover and play basically anything you are in the mood for on PlayStation 2, and to this day, I am still discovering games for the system that I had never heard of before, and I imagine I'll continue to do so for many years to come. If the PlayStation 2 was the only console you ever owned, you could die before you play all of its games. And in a way, I find that beautiful. It could very well be a lifelong commitment to continue to seek out art and entertainment that this platform enables, provided the console itself can survive with you to the very end. For this video, I realize it is impossible to adequately cover the sheer breadth of this system's library. I will inevitably miss games that are important to you, so here's how the structure of this video is going to work. First, I aim to tell the story chronologically, starting just before the year 2000 and wrapping up in around 2013, mainly to sell just how many of the PlayStation 2's games were significant events, either for the industry, or culturally, or just for me personally, because this is my video and I get to make the rules. This will help me to talk about as many games as I deem necessary, as this criteria is relevant to my interpretation of the PlayStation 2 and its impact. More than anything, though, I think this structure should convey just how valuable our time truly is. Without further ado, I'm Liam Triforce, and this is a PlayStation 2 retrospective. The specifics of the PlayStation 2's development have been kept relatively secret to this day, and all we really have to go off of are news articles and brief testimonies from former developers. Details of the console were fully revealed throughout 1999 at E3 and Tokyo Game Show, as well as through press releases from Sony, where all would become known. Let's take a look at everything that made up the PS2. First, the PS2 would be fully backwards compatible with all PS1 games and peripherals, which as far as I'm concerned, should always be the case on any console whenever possible. I'm not sure how quickly I would have purchased a PlayStation 5 today had it not offered performance enhancements for all of my PS4 games, as playing those games on a base PS4 left a lot to be desired in terms of performance. More to the point regarding the PS2, this allowed for a new generation of players to discover the games that defined the generation they were not around for. Even after I was born, I wouldn't be cognizant when the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and Sega Saturn were in their prime. But thanks to the PS2's immediate backwards compatibility, I was able to experience Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Final Fantasy VII, and many more games in my childhood. Second, the PS2 would have online functionality, much like the Dreamcast with its built-in modem. The PlayStation 2 would go on to feature several online multiplayer-capable games, and unlike the Xbox, where users had to pay a subscription fee to use Xbox Live, the PS2's networking functions were completely free to use, though some games such as MMOs still made you pay a subscription fee. Between the Tony Hawk games, Star Wars Battlefront, Killzone, Metal Gear Online, Final Fantasy XI, Burnout, and many more games, the PS2 had a healthy online scene throughout most of its life. Nothing on the console ever really compared to Halo 2 when it came to the sheer impact of that game's online multiplayer, but the PS2 had a ton of variety to make up for that. Third, and perhaps most crucial to the system's early success, since games for the PS2 were most often shipped on a DVD-ROM, Sony also made the logical decision to allow DVD playback on the console. It might sound silly today, where most media is available digitally, but DVD as a format was a big deal when it was introduced. Its 480p resolution suited most TVs at the time. It wasn't an analog format, so the picture would never deteriorate like VHS tapes did. And DVDs could hold far more content on them, meaning that box sets of TV shows were finally possible. You no longer had to manually record your shows to tapes when they aired. Though, to be honest, my parents still did that for me when I was a kid. To completely seal the deal, the PS2 itself was cheaper than most DVD players at the time, and buying one meant you'd also be able to play whatever companies decided to make for it. It was a no-brainer. Incidentally, this decision pretty much killed the Dreamcast, as the PS2 could do basically everything the Dreamcast could, and then some, ensuring that the PS2 would have barely any competition at launch in 2000. Finally, the hardware. While the PlayStation 2 was capable of generating millions of polygons per second, far more than the Dreamcast could, even in beautiful or high-speed games like Shenmue or Sonic Adventure 2, most developers that attempted to get games running on the PS2 will tell you that it was notoriously difficult to develop for. Without getting into the technical jargon, as I am by no means knowledgeable enough to sound like an authority on the subject, what I can tell you is that the PlayStation 2's CPU was called the Emotion Engine, paralleling Ken Kudaragi's statement that the system would be able to convey, quote, unprecedented emotions. This engine would be the heart of the PlayStation 2, and getting to grips with it would prove crucial in getting the best results out of the system. The GPU was lightning fast for its time, and the console was up to scratch in other ways, but the Emotion Engine was a complicated mess of moving parts that developers pretty much had to figure out if they wanted their game to sell. As we know, the PS2 went on to be massively successful, selling 7 times more units than either the GameCube or the Xbox. Putting your game on the PS2 meant reaching the widest install base in the industry. You'd be a fool not to. Sony did not provide the greatest documentation for understanding the PlayStation 2. In a thread on the Game Dev subreddit, a user recounted their experience developing for every console they'd worked on at the time, including the PS2. You are handed a 10-inch thick stack of manuals written by Japanese hardware engineers. The first time you read the stack, nothing makes any sense at all. The second time you read the stack, the third book makes a bit more sense because of what you learned in the 8th book. The machine has 10 different processors and 6 different memory spaces that all work in completely different ways. Getting the first triangle to appear on the screen took some teams over a month because it involved routing commands with no feedback about what you were doing wrong until you got every step along the way to be correct. They also said, quote, if you were willing to twist your game to fit the machine, you could get awesome results. And there is truth to this. When utilized to the fullest extent, developers would create games that were almost impossible on any other contemporary platform. I'm showing multiple games on screen right now, and although we will be talking about some of them later on in more detail, all I'll say for now is that these games pushed the PS2 to its absolute limits and truly showcased what it was capable of. When underutilized, you'd have PS2 ports that didn't quite measure up to other platforms for one reason or another, but were still certainly playable with a few blemishes. As you might know, Resident Evil 4 was developed as a GameCube exclusive as part of the ill-fated Capcom 5. But Capcom later reneged on the deal, and RE4 came to PS2, along with Beautiful Joe and Killer 7. Ultimately, the GameCube version was still superior. The PS2 version may have removed the GameCube version's forced letterboxing by offering a true widescreen option, but the game was quite blurry, its lighting was scaled back significantly, and its textures were of a much lower resolution. Some felt that these low-quality visuals added to the game's unnerving atmosphere, and maybe I would have at the time too. But Resident Evil 4 is one of the most visually impressive games on the GameCube, and watering that down just kind of sounds goofy to me. The sound quality is pretty bad too, and for a horror game with gorgeous audio design, that is a huge flaw. At their worst, you'd have PS2 ports that could make players think the games themselves were far worse than they actually were. Max Payne is one of the greatest action games ever made, and it would establish Finnish developer Remedy Entertainment's reputation for storytelling finesse and creativity. The PS2 version, however, is horrible. If this game didn't have bullet time, the frame rate would make the game unplayable when lots of enemies are on screen. Max Payne is a game that demands a stable frame rate, and this port just couldn't keep up. To be fair, Shadow of the Colossus would also drop to a staggeringly low frame rate, but that game was developed specifically for the PS2, and is an insane technical achievement for that reason, whereas Max Payne's PC and Xbox versions show you how the game is supposed to run. Thankfully, engines designed for simplifying the process of making games for PS2 would be developed, including one by Criterion Games that powered a vast majority of the 6th generation: Renderware. This engine was like the messiah of its generation, powering Grand Theft Auto and the rest of Rockstar's PS2 games, Burnout, Criterion's own racing game series, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and Beyond, Persona 3 and 4, and many, many more games. In the end, the difficulty of developing for PS2 had no bearing on the console's success, which is probably why Sony thought they could get away with the PS3, creating a console even more difficult to develop for, but that's a story for another time. The stars were aligned for Sony here. Of course, there was still one thing looming over them before launch day arrived. Be it a superstition or a real industry trend, no console manufacturer had ever dominated 2 console generations back to back, for one reason or another. The Super Nintendo performed well, but due to competition from Sega, it lost a chunk of market share and couldn't outsell its predecessor. Former president of Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, Chris Deering, recalled in an interview with Eurogamer that, despite this curse, he was determined to win round 2. We used to say it was like winning 2 gold medals in 2 back-to-back Olympics. It just never happened. So, I set that as a personal goal. Teiyu Goto, designer of the original PlayStation, designed the PlayStation 2 to be representative of the vastness of the universe. It's why he chose the color black, and when standing vertically, it looks like some sort of alien monolith. Mysterious, infinite, divine. Here's a quote from Takafumi Fujisawa, sound designer for the PS2. Kutaragi-san briefed us with the concept that was beyond our image, like a monolith floating in space with the earth in the background. I used the perfect 4th chords with stable harmony to express simple strength and the image of landing somewhere from space. As the PlayStation 2 starts up, you are invited into this vastness through harmonious, ethereal chords. The towers that gradually fill the void are all meant to represent your save data, symbols of your countless adventures and experiences over the years. You take this in before setting off once again, either for another adventure, or to float a bit longer in this ambiguous space. Much like the PS2 itself, this space, full of dreamlike sights and sounds, is both alluring and uncertain, and it straddles that line so well. I am endlessly drawn to the infinity of the console. To accentuate this sense of scale, the console's menus have details about them that always stuck with me. First of all, unlike the little animations on a GameCube memory card, or the still images on an Xbox hard drive, the PS2's memory card data represents your save files through full 3D models. Granted, some games just plastered an image onto each side of a cube, but others featured characters and other things from the games in question, and they would even react when you decided to delete the data. They feel like living embodiments of all of your experiences over the years. On the home screen, you'll see a ring of floating lights that guide you to each of the console's menus, and if you decide to adjust the console's date, time, and other settings, glass shapes in the background will morph and transform. Oh, and let's not forget about what happens when there's a disk read error. This infinity, as depicted in the console's startup and menus, would prove to be the perfect way to represent the PS2's gargantuan impact and games library. As mentioned, Sony wanted to win twice in a row, and although the launch lineup was underwhelming, Sony did stick the landing regardless, at least in terms of sales numbers. Everything else surrounding the launch was pandemonium. First, I'll provide a bit of context. When the original PlayStation launched in 1994, it became a smash hit. For a company just getting their feet wet in the games industry, it was an impressive success. Lines were long the day of, and a gray market quickly popped up after all of the launch units sold out, where some people importing the consoles would pay exorbitant amounts just to get their hands on one. Although sales did not outpace the Sega Saturn until that console was released in North America, and Sega completely botched everything for themselves, the PlayStation's strong sales early on were bolstered by a high-quality port of Ridge Racer. Eventually, the PlayStation became the system of the 5th generation. Not even the Nintendo 64 could keep up. Let's contrast this with the PlayStation 2's launch. Sony had basically no competition since their DVD playback announcement killed the Dreamcast then and there, and Nintendo and Microsoft's consoles were still a year out. DVD playback was a major selling point, even for people that didn't normally play video games, due to the console's low price. Its launch games included a port of Tekken Tag Tournament, back when people were still into arcade conversions, echoing the success of Ridge Racer in 1994. Tekken Tag Tournament would go on to sell nearly 3 million copies, by the way. Actual video game software sales were initially much slower, proving that the system's DVD playback was its most coveted feature. Former PlayStation Studios president Shuhei Yoshida remarked that the best-selling software on launch day was actually the DVD release of The Matrix. It was that big a deal. There were also apparently problems with PS2 memory cards, so even if people bought games, there was a chance they would have problems saving their data. So yeah, in Japan the PS2 was extraordinarily successful, but the launch was a little painful. In North America and Europe, similar issues arose, and in fact, they were made worse by supply shortages. In North America, Sony had to cut their initial shipment of consoles in half, from 1 million to just 500,000. In Europe, only 80,000 pre-orders were allocated, despite how wildly successful the original PlayStation was in Europe. Though Sony was accused of artificial scarcity to drive consumer demand worldwide, upon reflection it feels as though they were doing everything they could to stay on top of that demand. They would ship 100,000 units every week to America, but the PS2 remained largely out of stock until at least March 2001, due to the numerous factors I outlined. A great success for the company, but not without significant problems that hurt their public perception and bottlenecked their sales. Shuhei Yoshida reflected on this on stage at Develop Brighton in 2018, stating that the company was, quote, awfully unprepared for the PS2's launch. Because of the fast transition between PS1 and PS2, we had no idea how the industry manages these things. He also mentioned that there weren't many games to choose from at launch, but I'd argue that was mostly an issue when it launched in Japan. In North America, the PS2 had 29 launch titles, and more titles released in Japan throughout 2000 anyway. There was plenty of variety. Nothing that would revolutionize the industry like Super Mario 64 or Halo, but enough so that there was plenty to choose from and enjoy. Ultimately, the launch would be a small blip in the PS2's long successful career, and that goes for its launch titles too. They would merely foreshadow the revolution to come, just as the original PlayStation did. When the PlayStation launched, all that was necessary was a high-quality port of Ridge Racer, and people flocked to the console in droves. Sure, you also had Rayman and Air Combat, but Ridge Racer proved itself to be the must-have game. This was back when arcade ports were more than enough to ship a console with. Plus, with the PS2's additional features like DVD playback and immediate PS1 backwards compatibility, what were the games to check out? When it comes to PS2 launch titles, your mileage will likely vary. Like I said, none of them were very long or super impactful, but a handful of them were pretty cool. I haven't played all of them, including games like Armored Core 2 and Kessen, but here's a few that I want to talk about. Tekken Tag Tournament still remains unique as a spin-off, as it doesn't overly concern itself with balancing for hardcore fans. It is just dedicated to being as much fun as possible. You have pretty much every character from across the franchise, and the ability to switch between two of them on the fly to conserve health, encouraging you to try out as many characters and combinations as you can. Tag Tournament 2 also strengthened my love for this kind of laid-back, party-oriented fighting game, but despite this, the mechanical depth of Tekken would never be sacrificed. I can always have a good time with the Tag Tournament games when I play them today. Time Splitters was awesome too. Though the first entry in the series is more of a proof of concept for what the sequels would become, there is still a lot of fun to be had with it. I'll be honest, it's probably my favorite of the PS2 launch games, even more so than Tag Tournament. Time Splitters was made by former Rare developers that worked on GoldenEye and Perfect Dark for Nintendo 64. And much like those games, each level is objective-based. You have to infiltrate a specific time period across a span of 100 years, retrieve an item, and rush to the exit portal while being stormed by Time Splitters. Though the objectives are not nearly as in-depth in this game as they could be in GoldenEye or Perfect Dark, and the campaign only features 9 levels, what is here is great, with each level making the game feel like an animated adventure movie of the era, like The Road to El Dorado or Treasure Planet. You know, with guns. The final level has perhaps my favorite aesthetic, a very colorful, cartoonishly vibrant vision for a futuristic transit hub. Reminds me of Pizza Planet in Toy Story or Space Mountain. On top of that, the multiplayer rocked, being one of the first PS2 games to support the multi-tap. You could play through the entire campaign in co-op, and there was even a map maker, which allowed players to make their own levels for use in multiplayer matches. It was a must-have launch game, and its sequels would go on to prove themselves as some of the finest in their genre, with fully fleshed out dynamic and varied objectives in line with the setting and themes of each level, full voice acting and animated cutscenes, way more weapons to mess around with, and a proper storyline tying everything together. Time Splitters 2 and Future Perfect would also be multi-platform, meaning that GameCube and Xbox owners could also check them out, but Time Splitters got its start here, as a launch game for the PS2. The same goes for SSX. It was an arcadey downhill snowboarding game in the vein of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater that encouraged players to either rack up as many points as possible before reaching the bottom of the mountain, or race to the bottom as fast as they could. The physics were excellent, and it was satisfying to improve and take risks for higher rewards. The aesthetic of this entire game and its packaging also reeks of the early 2000s, and I mean that in the nicest way possible. Through its fonts and curved futuristic UI, this period of graphic design was just something else. SSX would go on to become a beloved series, with SSX 3 being regarded as one of the best sports games ever made. That game's mountain was fully seamless, meaning that the courses you'd compete on were part of a sprawling mountain, and you could theoretically start from the top of the mountain and reach the bottom without seeing a single loading screen. Other than the games I've mentioned, Rockstar Games found early success with the original Midnight Club and Smuggler's Run, and there were plenty of ports of games from other platforms like Dead or Alive 2 and Unreal Tournament. Oh, and since Ridge Racer was such an important launch game to the PS1, we should talk about the PS2's Ridge Racer game. Ridge Racer 5 had a lot to live up to. The PS1 ultimately received 4 main series Ridge Racer games, but I felt Type 4 stood as the team's crowning achievement on that console, and a fine work of art. Released in 1998 in Japan and 1999 in the rest of the world, the game was imbued with a beautiful, meditative sense of hope for what the new millennium would be like. Each major race takes place throughout 1999, with the final race being set on New Year's Eve. As you proved yourself to each club manager through honing your driving skills, they eventually become more and more vulnerable, wishing you the best in each race and revealing some of their personal regrets, until eventually, you'd master driving as cleanly as possible in the final race, shooting hoops, crossing the finish line in first place just as the clock hits midnight. Your manager learns to make peace with their grief and regrets, and the year 2000 represents a fresh start. A man can change as long as he lives. The game's acid jazz and progressive house soundtrack heightens its themes tenfold, and it honestly might be my favorite PS1 soundtrack of all time, transcending the game itself. There's nothing quite like clutching out a victory as Move Me reaches its climax. I swear to you, this is probably the only racing game I've ever played that legitimately moved me to tears. Because I was fighting to see more of each manager's story, I fought tooth and nail to sharpen my driving skills and prove myself to them. And when I was finally able to edge out a victory, I got emotional. What other racing game can do that? The game's hopeful tone tied the whole experience together, and it's something I believe everyone should play before they die. So yeah, as I mentioned, Ridge Racer 5 had big shoes to fill. While it plays beautifully with a much more fluid drift, a rock-solid 60 frames per second, the same compelling structure of the previous game, and a welcome increase in challenge, it lacked the emotional hook of Type 4, and it wouldn't quite leave the same impact, despite being a fun game in its own right. Also, Reiko isn't in this game. She was replaced, only to immediately reappear in the next installment as if nothing happened. While Ridge Racer 5 wouldn't quite recapture the beauty of Type 4, the hope that game inspired still feels appropriate to bring up, as the PS2 was only just getting started. All of these games would foreshadow the explosion of creativity this generation would bring us, as several of these series and developers would go on to flourish. A better future was on the horizon. The PS2 still needed some time to blossom, and blossom it did. Because at the end of 2000, we got The Bouncer.
The Bouncer!
Okay, no, I'm joking. This game is booty cheeks. The Bouncer is basically an in-engine PS2 movie that breaks out into a game sometimes. About a third of your time with this game is actually hitting things. The rest is cutscenes. However, unlike other action games of that ilk, such as Metal Gear Solid 4 or Asura's Wrath, which are both extraordinarily well-directed films that break out into super fun games, The Bouncer is neither a good movie nor a good game. Behold the donkey kick, the most powerful move in the game. That's what most of this boils down to. Though it aimed to showcase what the PS2 could enable, it was not a great first showing for Square. They are lucky that Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts worked out for them. Indeed, we were on the cusp of something great. Despite the problematic launch of the PS2, it was clear that this first wave of games was representative of a hope for the future. The same hope that was on display at the midnight launch for the system at this GameStop in Lewisville, Texas. At the time, it might have felt like blind consumerism to just be this excited for a games console, but it marked the genesis for a generation that would never, ever be matched. And though people had hope for what games would look like over the next several years, I doubt they could have seen any of it coming. Their hopes did pay off. Hope can often be seen as a crutch rather than a practical mindset. It guarantees no positive outcome, and hope can only prove ineffective when it is dashed, like a ship dashed against the rocks. But it is often all we have to hold on to. When things are bleak, there is nothing wrong with having hope for something better. And it is a nice feeling when that something better finally arrives. You know what happened this year. I wasn't even cognizant, and yet its impact would be felt throughout the decade I grew up in. In such an uncertain and anxious time for the world, people needed an escape, and some incredible works were released this year. Video games, too, would provide entertainment for those seeking refuge from the real world. In fact, 2001 would be the dawn of a new era for video games, and where the PS2 would truly hit its stride. The Dreamcast would finally be discontinued in March, with its final significant game being Sonic Adventure 2, a game that in its own right would find a massive cult following, but this represented the PS2 putting the final nail in the coffin of Sega's console development. Though the Xbox provided fierce competition with Halo, it too would not be enough to even come close to dethroning the PS2. This would be the year that the PS2's market dominance would be established thanks to a few landmark games. One step at a time, though. Square would rebound after the failure of the Bouncer with Final Fantasy X in July, and I feel like for many, this was the PS2's first must-have game. I only recently played this game for the first time as I've been slow to get into Final Fantasy. I grew up playing 7, and since then I've finished 9, and now this one. While a part of me still prefers 9 solely for its incredible story and characters, ultimately it was clear to me why it was such a landmark release, and I had a blast with it in spite of, and perhaps even because of, its deviations from the PS1 Final Fantasy games. Though your journey through the world of Spira is much more linear than previous games, the entire game was designed around this thanks to the Sphere Grid system, introducing strategy into your progression through the game as you choose which spheres to slot in and which branching paths to take and invest in. Also, for the first time since Final Fantasy IV originated the active time battle system, Final Fantasy X does away with it and introduces the conditional turn-based battle system. And oddly enough, this system ended up giving me some of my favorite combat in Final Fantasy so far. I always felt like ATB peaked with Chrono Trigger anyway, thanks to the dual and triple tech system, and being able to sort through your characters on the fly and reorganize initiative for each of them depending on what move would be best was refreshing after using ATB for so long. I think more than anything, the most memorable part was watching the relationship between Tidus and Yuna blossom. It's the emotional hook of the whole game. FF10 was notable at the time for its facial animation and full voice acting, and even though the English dub could be wonky at times, the famous laughing scene was not one of those moments. It's actually one of my favorite scenes in the entire game. The two of them attempt to cheer themselves up during such a bleak period by forcing themselves to laugh. And it sounds stupid, at which point they burst into genuine laughter and they feel a little better. It's a great scene. I hope anyone else that has played the game can agree with me. They're just so cute together. It's crazy to think that Final Fantasy IX and X were only a year apart. We went from this to this in a year. The jump from 2D to 3D was one thing, but jumping from the PS1 to the PS2 must have felt unreal. And despite its scope, the DVD-ROM format ensured that the game could fit on a single disc. Another one of my favorite aspects of FF10 is its UI. A lot of it screams old internet in the early 2000s, and I feel this also extends to a lot of the atmospheric elements of the game, especially Xanarkin's initial depiction as a futuristic utopia. Speaking of the early 2000s, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. With the addition of the revert, half-pipes would no longer end your combos, meaning that you could, in theory, infinitely string a combo together. This is on top of the amazing level design and goals. I'm confident in saying this game is perfect, and I could replay it any day. I do have a retrospective on this series if you'd like to check it out, because it had a pretty awesome run on the PS2. But the particular element that made it stand out on this console specifically was its online multiplayer. Be it Graffiti, Combo Mambo, or even Capture the Flag, THPS multiplayer has always been one of my happy places. And it was the first PS2 game to have it, too. They pulled this off on the PS2 even before the Ethernet adapter was officially released. Speaking of pulling off combos, Devil May Cry. The original Devil May Cry was born as Resident Evil 4, but it became an over-the-top action horror fusion that blended the level design of Resident Evil and atmosphere of gothic horror, with some stylish action and gags that are ingrained in my memory forever. Like a lot of games did for their respective genres in 2001, it forever changed the way action games would be made. Naughty Dog would also get their feet wet with the PS2 through Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy. I am almost certain that this was the first PS2 game I ever played. For that reason, I have a lot of nostalgia for this game, but I still think as a platformer in the vein of Super Mario 64, it holds up quite well, especially for its completely seamless world, its variety and exploration, and its bouncy and responsive control scheme, heightened by the squash and stretch in the game's animations. I ultimately didn't have much interest in its sequels due to their drastic change in direction, but I'm curious to see if I'd enjoy them today. Also in 2001, I would be sorely remiss if I didn't mention Klonoa 2. The original game is one of my favorite PS1 games of all time, and Klonoa 2 is just as good, and in some ways even better. As a puzzle platformer, it is super creative, but the heart of both games are their stories and theming. The first game was about dreams and their ephemeral nature, while the second game is about emotions, and it portrays sadness and isolation in a way that I could have never anticipated. I'm intentionally leaving details out, but these games are must-plays. They are deceptive in their beauty. They lull you into a false sense of security with their visuals and gameplay, and then you sit through the end credits in tears. On that note, I'd like to delve into the 2001 PS2 games that I felt most strongly advanced games as an art form, and why I felt this was such a crucial year for the console. In literature, in music, and in film, there have been works that transgress societal norms, challenging what can be depicted by establishing its own artistic merit. While the perception of video games and their artistic merit varies depending on what country we're talking about, in North America throughout the 90s and 2000s, video games and consoles were often sold at toy stores, further cementing their perception as nothing more than toys, even with games being explicitly designed for consumption by adults. 2001 would be the year that things began to change. Games like Metal Gear Solid foreshadowed what was to come, and this year marked a turning point for games as art. And a lot of that happened on the PlayStation 2. First, there's Silent Hill 2. Its portrayal of the titular town was different from the previous game's atmosphere of mystery and dread, instead capitalizing on the town's tendency to mess with the player and the game's protagonist, transforming it into a reflection of its visitor's psychological state. Silent Hill 2 explores the various facets of guilt through overt and extensive symbolism, designing a personal hell for its visitors, and even elegantly showcasing taboo, traumatic subject matter and its effects. Silent Hill 2's interactivity made unraveling each character's psychology all the more compelling, and I believe the game to be one of the most important ever released. Despite how horrific the town can be, I've always viewed it as a place of healing. Confronting your demons and surviving them, which is why the game resonated so deeply with me. I know what my Silent Hill would look like, and I'd like to survive it. Silent Hill 3 would follow in 2003, and I consider it a masterpiece as well. This time a direct follow-up to the first game, you control Heather Mason as events relating to her birth plague her and her father. Though it is presented as a narrative sequel to the first game, it is still very much laden with its own symbolism, this time revolving around Heather Mason's transition from adolescence to adulthood, her own identity, and her experiences with womanhood. There are plenty of people who swear by this game and consider it their favorite game in the series, and for good reason. Ultimately, Silent Hill would prove itself to be a quintessential psychological horror game, taking inspiration from Stephen King and movies like Jacob's Ladder to build a symbolic journey through a character's psyche with elements that only games could convey. It forces you to confront that which its characters either consciously or subconsciously avoid. For more of my thoughts on Silent Hill, I'd recommend you check out my personal journey through the series, recounted here in this video. Next, another Konami-published game, Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. Though at a surface level it is a major deviation from the first game due to its focus on Raiden rather than Solid Snake, he proves to be the right protagonist for the story the game tells. While the game expands on the stealth sandbox of the first game, by far the most compelling aspect of the game for me was its narrative. Though its philosophical and political nature divided critics at the time, it soon came to light just how much insight the game had into modern-day politics and culture, as Raiden unravels the conspiracy of the Patriots. The game sheds light on a world where truth and fiction become harder to discern from one another, and its overt warnings only become increasingly more relevant to this day with the rise of artificial intelligence, social and political echo chambers, and much, much more along those lines that make the world we live in so tumultuous. If you've played this game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And yet, the game ends with a message of hope. Even in a world where external forces aim to influence your thoughts, we can take solace in the fact that our thoughts are our own, and that we will always have control over our legacy. Not just through our genes, but our art as well. Metal Gear Solid 2 is a profound game, and it would not be Hideo Kojima's only solid outing on the PS2. More on that later. Finally, the game that left the largest impact on the industry and games as a medium, for better or worse. You may prefer the games I've mentioned already to this one, but you cannot deny its impact. In Edinburgh, Scotland, there was a little studio called DMA Design. At the time, they were rapidly hiring developers in order to finish a project in time for release. With the Grand Theft Auto games on PC, DMA Design wanted players to have as much freedom as possible. Even if players didn't necessarily need to go postal to complete objectives, the very notion that you could was enough to make a splash at the time. But the impact was nowhere near as widespread as it would be with Grand Theft Auto 3. Grand Theft Auto 3 would go on to sell 11 million copies on the PS2 alone, which for the time was unbelievable. And with it came a revolution in game design and a firm push on what games could portray and allow the player to do. Though RPGs like Daggerfall had open-ended worlds to explore, as an action-adventure game, players interacted with GTA 3's Liberty City as if they were a part of it. Everything you did, completing missions, exploring and driving for fun, messing with pedestrians, escaping the cops, looking for hidden packages, you were free to do all of it whenever and however you liked, as if you were controlling a real person. At least, that's what it felt like to me when I first played it. Sure, I had known of RPGs with worlds like that, as mentioned, but none gave you control like this, and none were built in such vivid detail. Liberty City was built to emulate and parody reality throughout. Radio stations had satirical commercials and interstitials from DJs, pedestrians would react if you attacked someone, and spout nonsense as they roamed the streets. The weather could change and shift from clear skies to rain, and even fog, and your headlights would reflect off the wet roads beneath you. All the while, you'd be playing as a mute criminal that goes around taking on jobs from the crime families and crooks of Liberty City, evading police all the while. But the interesting thing about GTA 3 is that I, as well as many others, couldn't help but ignore the missions, and just go explore and see what was possible in this world. It elicited a similar level of curiosity and exploration as Super Mario 64, with Mario's full three-dimensional control, his wide assortment of moves, and the 3D levels built for them all driving people to discover what was possible in this new paradigm. I think that is probably the highest compliment you can possibly give a game, as it is essentially saying that it paved the way for all games of its kind, while also creating a sense of wonder and enjoyment that I had never experienced in a game before. Indeed, GTA 3 was the reason action-adventure games have since scrambled to craft open worlds for the player to explore. And yet, DMA Design, now Rockstar North, still remains one of the few studios to know how to imbue life into them. Even if GTA 3 doesn't necessarily hold up today as far as realism goes, I still hold so much fondness for its atmosphere, and for the memories I created in that world. Additionally, it was a watershed moment for the medium because it had players take control of a criminal and take on missions in a world of crime, in a world of this level of detail, with this much freedom. Sure, Grand Theft Auto had always been the subject of controversy because of its premise since inception, but none had seen a crime game depicted with such fidelity to real life before. But that's just it. It was so important for a game to have players take control of a character that could perform actions that they wouldn't otherwise commit in real life, just to demonstrate that it wasn't obscenity for obscenity's sake, but rather An exploration of innate human curiosity. Sure, you could do all of these horrible things that had certain people up in arms, but you didn't have to in order to complete the game. Claude himself was just a blank slate, and the players could decide who they were going to be. You could even go a step further, and rather than play the missions and assume the role of a criminal taking on odd jobs, and just get lost in the world they'd built for you, completely ethically. How long would you be willing to do that before your own morbid curiosity got the better of you, and you were willing to let the real fun begin? The boundaries this game pushed were for the betterment of the medium in both design and artistic merit, and Rockstar North wouldn't stop there. We'll come back to the work of Rockstar North on the PS2 multiple times throughout this video, as Rockstar Games as a company put out a ridiculous number of games on the PS2. It was their stomping grounds for sure. Though truthfully, I have yet to mention the PS2 game from this year that I would say best utilized the medium's uniqueness to tell a story. And that's because it was heavily overshadowed by everything else that exploded onto the PS2 around this time. Though it did not sell well, it left a silent but palpable impact on developers and fans, and it would come to be regarded as one of the greatest and most important games ever made. It's...
The Bouncer!
No. It's Ico. Locked away in a mysterious castle for having horns, a young boy named Ico attempts to flee, and he soon meets a girl named Yorda, who is being held captive by her mother, the castle's queen, as she plans to use Yorda to be reborn. Ico must take Yorda by the hand and guide her through the castle, solving puzzles and thoroughly exploring each area so that he can continue to create a path for the two of them. While director Fumito Ueda regrets not being able to convey a strong central gameplay hook and marketing, which is why the game's sales weren't so strong, the game is so intensely focused on executing its vision. The entire time, an unspoken bond between you as Ico and Yorda is being built, all through gameplay. Ico guides Yorda by the hand and catches her when she jumps each time. Every save point allows the two of you to spend time together and to take a break. Through Ueda's design by subtraction approach, every single facet of the game's design is built through the emotional development of a boy and a girl holding hands. No one should miss out on playing this game if they like video games in any capacity. It is moving, and it is a compelling argument for this medium's value as an art form, right down to its box art. No, not the American box art, the original art used in Japan and Europe. It was painted by Ueda himself, and inspired by the nostalgia of the infinite. Its dreamlike, ethereal qualities accurately reflect the atmosphere of the game itself. And even in this painting, Ico and Yorda are right there, holding hands and escaping together. And that is the core essence of Ico. Everything is built from that. For more of my thoughts on the works of Team Ico, I would recommend you watch my video on the games. I'm still quite proud of it. As you can see, 2001 left us with an astounding catalog of games, and this is just on the PS2 alone. At this point, the PS2 achieved total market domination. No one could catch up, and the games would just keep coming. There were a handful of games from this year that marked continued success for the PS2, as well as the developers that made games for it. Square would find further success with an unlikely collaboration between them and the Walt Disney Company with Kingdom Hearts. Here's how I got into the series. My first exposure to the series was through a poster for Kingdom Hearts 2 that was on display near the bathrooms at the Famous Players near me, which sadly closed in the late 2000s. I'm mentioning it hoping that some other Canadians my age remember these. In fact, that same poster space is also where I was first exposed to the Sly Cooper series, through an ad for Sly 3. In the 90s, the cinema totally embraced an explosive, colorful aesthetic, and at the turn of the millennium, it had a cool, blue, futuristic look, appropriate for the tone of this video. Sadly, all of them were bought out by the Canadian company Cineplex, and now most of them look like an average modern-day cinema. Textbook sanitization of any imaginative interior design. Much like how we went from customizable PS3 and PS4 themes to the same universally bland menu on PS5. Either way, after seeing the poster, I knew I wanted a PS2. I love Disney films, though I was honestly a bigger fan of Pixar as a kid. and Nomura's characters seemed to jump out at me as well, reminding me of my recently discovered love for Japanese animation, which at the time was spurred by Studio Ghibli and Astro Boy. It wasn't going to happen though, as one home system each generation on its own was a major investment, and my parents wanted to stick with Nintendo for my brother and I. I did see commercials for 358 Days Over 2 when I had a DS, and I remember the song in the commercial sticking with me. The song, by the way, was Sanctuary by Hikaru Utada. I wouldn't hear it again until I played Kingdom Hearts 2 years later, upon which I cried as it unearthed a childhood memory long forgotten. I wouldn't play the first game until I purchased my own PS2 at a pawn shop with some birthday money I'd saved. It was one of the first games I owned for the system, but I wouldn't get very far. My first copy of Kingdom Hearts would always lock up at a specific moment, and through the power of video editing, I can actually recreate this for you. I was able to play through the entirety of Sora's dive to the heart, but right after he is forewarned of his destiny and he is swallowed by the Heartless, the game hangs on this black screen, and all you can hear is the sounds of the ocean. I'm not kidding. I was never able to get the next cutscene to load beyond just the sounds of the tide. I thought that I'd actually failed somehow, and it creeped me out until I found a YouTube video of the game and realized that my disc was just scratched. So I got a refund for the game and waited. It wouldn't be until I bought the PS3 collections that I would finally play through the series proper. Though my dad always compared combining Disney and Final Fantasy to combining peanut butter and mustard, it actually makes for a more whimsical and memorable game than you'd think. Plus, it, and especially Kingdom Hearts 2, boasted some of my favorite combat systems in an action RPG. Speaking of seeing those posters, let's talk about Sly Cooper. Seeing as this era was a continuation of the age where 3D platformers starring anthropomorphic animals thrived, it's no wonder developers looking to make a splash on the PS2 would pursue that kind of game. But Sly Cooper wasn't just a 3D platformer. It was also a stealth game, and a very good one at that. I enjoyed what I played of Sly 1, but Sly 2 Band of Thieves kind of blew me away, as each massive level revolved around you setting up and performing a heist. It was a very exciting idea for a platformer. As for the PS2 mascot that seems to have endured the longest, I unfortunately haven't played enough of Ratchet & Clank to really expound on its impact, but I can tell you that its irreverent dialogue, open-ended levels in the vein of Jak and Daxter, and the fact that most of its gameplay revolves around weapons you collect do kind of tell me everything I need to know about why it has stuck around for so long. It seems malleable enough as a game and a refreshing enough platformer to stick it out through the industry trending away from platformers. To wrap up our discussion of 2002 games, I want to talk about a couple of games that I feel are synonymous with the atmosphere of the PlayStation 2, and they are games that I constantly think about when I want to revisit simpler times. The first is another of Rockstar North's smash hits, Grand Theft Auto Vice City. This pick is ironic as it's set in the 1980s, a decade that I never experienced, but through an unabashed love for crime dramas of the era like Miami Vice and Scarface, a beautiful realization of an 80s Miami, and a refinement of the things established in their previous game, Vice City is the easiest choice for me when I just want to throw on some Mr. Mister and drive around to remind myself of when life was simpler. Through this game, Rockstar North essentially got an entirely new generation hooked on 80s nostalgia through its bright neon colors, its absolutely stellar soundtrack, its parodies of and homages to 80s crime fiction, and its bright sunny beaches. I consider the early 2000s the era of blue skies and beaches for video games. I previously propped the turn of the millennium up as an era of hope for the future of the medium, and after that came an era of instilling peace and momentary bliss, and beaches seem to be the perfect setting for that feeling. This setting is one of the first that comes to mind when I think about the early 2000s now. On top of that, Tommy Vercetti managed to make floral Hawaiian shirts look badass again, in perhaps the truest homage to characters like Thomas Magnum. Of course, this is just one way a game managed to become atmospherically synonymous with the PlayStation 2. If you want something that feels all-encompassing, look no further than Tekken 4. Ironically, Tekken 4 is something of a black sheep in the series. It introduced uneven asymmetrical stages with ramps, stairs, and inclines, as well as obstacles like railings, phone booths, cars, and much more. You could even juggle someone into a low roof, which would end your combo. This was a result of the series' attempt to steer away from the infinitely scrolling backgrounds of previous games, and take full advantage of what was possible with true 3D environments. These battles would start to feel more like the battles in the dynamic stages of Dead or Alive because of these changes. And on top of that, the game's atmosphere was initially derided for being overly serious and gritty. Because of this, Tekken 5 would return to the series' roots. That's right, Tekken players had 3 games on the PS2 to choose from, depending on the mood they were in. Despite its perceived flaws from a competitive and design standpoint, I ultimately view Tekken 4 as the most memorable game in the main series, precisely because of its gameplay differences and tone. Certainly not the best or even my favorite, but I came to absolutely love everything about its atmosphere. Plus, it's hard to be so bitter about its competitive viability now that 20 years have passed. Anything once thought to be unbalanced or bad design, I just find entertaining and intriguing. But the atmosphere of Tekken 4, oh man. This entire game could be synonymous with the various moods and emotions of the PS2, and the era it was released in. Every stage is crafted beautifully, from the infinitely stretching airport tarmac at night, illuminated by lights guiding planes in, the streets of Shibuya, the underground parking garage, the beach, yeah, you can add this game to the list of beach aesthetics from the early 2000s, and the fight on the rooftops against the backdrop of the city skyline. The game is quite grounded compared to previous entries, all with a strong sense of identity in its use of cool colors and moody lighting. As if this is a late-night fight club founded in the heart of the city, and the music is consistently top-notch. Oh my god, the amount of times I've fought on the rooftop just to hear this piece, and the way the drums kick in at the end of every round, there is nothing like playing a few matches up here. Every single aspect of this game bleeds charisma, right down to the narrator for the game's story mode. His calm, soothing voice coupled with the filter, I can't get enough of it.
Brisbane, Australia, a city crowded with buildings, new and old. Nestled amongst the towering buildings was a small dojo. A young man trained there in silence, his face hidden by the hood of his jacket. Day after day, Jin trained in the traditional art of karate. Ever since his betrayal by Heihachi, Jin loathed anything related to the Mishimas, his lineage, his fighting style, the devil gene in his blood, everything.
God, it rocks. And speaking of that jacket, Jin's outfit in Tekken 4 is by far the coolest thing he's ever worn. I know I'm using that word a lot, but there's no better way to describe the atmosphere of Tekken 4. It is really, really cool. I revisit this game sometimes just to exist in this game's interpretation of the new millennium. Tekken 4 was a vision of not just what Tekken might look like in the modern era, but a snapshot into the team's vision of the world back then. A night in the city in the early 2000s. A day at the beach, a trip to the mall. Though a lot of the game felt darker and more serious, reflecting on this game brings me back to a time when the future looked a lot brighter. It also gave us this soundbite.
Chicken.
" 2003 would be the year Atlus released Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne. This was a huge project for director Katsura Hashino, as it was the first fully 3D entry in a highly regarded series of JRPGs, and it would be the first one to find mainstream success in English-speaking territories later on. Featuring Dante from the Devil May Cry series. Here's the funny thing about SMT3. First of all, I love it, but that's not the funny part. It's an incredible game with an enveloping, desolate sense of atmosphere right from the moment you awaken in the hospital as the Demi-Fiend after conception. Its gameplay, as expected from SMT, is a lot of fun to gradually master as you collect and fuse new monsters, seduce some demons and punch others in the face, equip various Magatamas, that sort of thing. The core gameplay loop is always extremely compelling in pretty much any game in the franchise that focuses on this loop, including a couple of games we'll mention later in this video. But it is especially memorable here because of how bullshit hard this game can be. This is the funny part. I am so enthusiastic about saying all of this when I still haven't beaten Matador. If you try to debuff him, he will simply say, "Don't care, Dakunda," and reset all of your hard work, wasting your MP in the process. I've found Fog Breath to be useful, as it decreases his ability to dodge your attacks, but unless you're a high enough level, this battle can still be a game of chance at times. Thank you, Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. I still have to grind several levels and fuse stronger demons. Someday I aim to complete my love for this game. Someday. Speaking of RPGs, Square, in their final FF release before merging with Enix, would release a direct sequel to Final Fantasy X, appropriately titled Final Fantasy X-2. This was the first time Square would ever directly follow up a mainline FF title, and they were following up a beloved game, so let's see what this game has going for it. I think I've found my favorite Final Fantasy game, everyone. While I am joking around, I do really like this game. It takes guts to release a game this unserious at the onset as a direct sequel to an ephemeral love story, and I can imagine it probably frustrated a lot of people, maybe even to this day. But I can't help but respect it. I love these characters, and I'm happy to see Yuna taking care of business like this, after previously requiring a guardian to escort her between temples. Plus, as you switch classes throughout the game, each character gets new clothing and accessories thanks to the dress spheres. X-2 also enables a huge amount of player freedom, a stark contrast to the deliberate linearity of 10. You can visit each region as they are made available to you at your leisure, experiencing episodic stories in the vein of something like Cowboy Bebop or Samurai Jack, all while progressing the overarching narrative. Your party configuration is always based on your choice of dress spheres, which you can switch between on the fly, and the game even has multiple endings depending on your actions. It is such a distinct game and a very fun one to experience. I sincerely think it deserves more credit. Continuing their unbelievable string of annual releases, Rockstar North did have another game this year, but it wasn't Grand Theft Auto. Shocking, I know, but the game they did release still caused quite a stir. As I mentioned, I felt Grand Theft Auto was very much an exploitation of innate human curiosity, as its more reprehensible acts were choices that you could make. Plus, as I've said, the game was very much written under a satirical lens. Manhunt did not give you a choice. You yourself play as a death row inmate that is given a second lease on life through a disgraced movie director forcing you into a game of survival. All of your enemies in this film, in which you use stealth to outsmart and survive, are usually depraved, deranged, or disgusting people, known for crimes that I can't even say without risking a yellow $sign in my YouTube studio. In fact, for the sake of this video, I probably have to censor most of the executions, as this is simply one of the most violent games I have ever played. I say that not because its gore is cartoonish or over the top like in Doom, but because its violence is so sickeningly realistic that playing it makes me uncomfortable, even though I am acutely aware of my own desire to seek it out. That's just it. Manhunt is almost certainly itself a commentary on both the desire for more plentiful, realistic violence in video games, as there was no real way to rationalize and contextualize it this time. Understandably, the media had a field day with this game, entirely missing the point of it being a game for adults, just like Grand Theft Auto, and a game fully intent on being disturbing, yet darkly comedic through commentary from the director, voiced by Brian Cox, by the way, and the portrayal of its gangs. It is also still a method of peeling back the curtain on human curiosity, as you are rewarded with a higher ranking for holding that button down and performing more brutal executions, as if to say, this is what you wanted, right? Well, you're getting it. You're taken aback by the violence, but the notion of seeing it draws players in, and that's where Manhunt ultimately succeeds as art. It has something to say, and it does so with grace despite appearances. It appeals to those seeking to be disturbed and shocks the uninitiated, as well as those that think they can actually stomach its brutal violence. To ultimately sell this notion, Rockstar North created an atmosphere unlike any horror game I've ever played, demonstrating that the machinations of a human mind can be far more terrifying than a fictional monster. These people you run into, listen to, and interact with throughout the game, placed around each set by the director, are thoroughly unsettling. You feel so alone and as though you're walking on eggshells throughout the entire game, seeing as you are only at your most effective when hidden, and everyone around you is absolutely vile. The characters are beyond slimy, the environments are dark and grimy, and the soundtrack is creepy and at times stomach-churning, as well as often being reminiscent of an 80s John Carpenter film, as if it were created for the 2000s. It proves to be an incredible mixture for a horror game, and possibly one of my favorites, though it does have some problems like repetition, some strange unforgiving difficulty spikes, and some pretty awful gunplay. Revisiting this game for this video has ultimately been a blessing. My original video on the game is quite terrible, and I know a lot of people like it, but I wrote it without any real tact whatsoever. I was much younger and I had just started writing videos in that style, and it's probably the video I'd like to remake more than anything else. I said some really goofy stuff in it. For now, nestling my discussion of Manhunt into this larger video on the PS2 will have to do. The PS2 was truly excellent for horror fans. We've already talked about Silent Hill and Manhunt, but there was also Siren, the next game directed by Silent Hill 1 director Keiichiro Toyama, and it was uniquely scary because you could use the sight-jacking mechanic to see through the eyes of all of your enemies as they hunt you down. This allows you to plan a route through each level, and although most of the game is contingent on trial and error, it can make for an incredibly tense game, especially when visibility is so low that you can only rely on the sight lines of your enemies. There was also Fatal Frame, which through its focus on photography for dealing with ghostly apparitions, managed to create a combat system that was not only creepy, but created a tense game of risk-reward, as you have to stand your ground to deal as much damage as possible whilst tracking your target. It is wholly unique without being any less tense than stiffly aiming a gun. That, and because of the nature in which ghosts appear, the game just loves to mess with the player. Is it hostile, or just there to guide you or otherwise mess with you? The only way to find out is to just let these games mess with your perception of what is real. There's also Rule of Rose, which I have not played, but I wonder if it's $1,000 because it's actually any good. Speaking of horror games, Resident Evil. The series ultimately had a more subdued presence on PS2 than the original PlayStation, thanks to Nintendo securing the series for GameCube that generation. It received some ports like Code Veronica X and the aforementioned RE4, but it also received an original entry called Resident Evil Outbreak, which was also released in 2003. The reason the PS2 was chosen was specifically for its online capabilities. Xbox obviously had Live, but that console was practically dead in Japan. Either way, the game did co-op Resident Evil long before RE5, and each chapter is a big puzzle box that you and your friends have to gradually unravel by working together, grabbing each key item little by little, solving puzzles and fighting zombies along the way, while your infection rate gradually increases. You have to work together in every aspect to stay alive. With the exception of the Hive and the final chapter's lack of clear direction at times, the game is a lot of fun to play with friends, and still manages to feel like an extension of classic Resident Evil through inventory management, fixed camera angles, and all that good stuff. It also very much feels of its era in its UI. Playing it today through custom servers is a hell of a blast from the past. Indeed, every kind of game imaginable was created for the PS2. As mentioned, if your game was developed to be multi-platform, it was strongly advised that you make a PS2 version. I've avoided talking about multi-platform games too much in this video, as we'd be here for weeks if I did. But so many of the system's most beloved games were released simultaneously on other platforms, so it would feel disingenuous not to at least show some games on screen here. Even though they were not exclusive to the PS2, the point is that the PS2 had close to everything you could ever want, even after its relevance began to fade. There's nothing quite like filling your belly with diet soda and playing Burnout Revenge for the PS2. Additionally, when talking about the PS2, it is impossible not to mention the absolute flood of licensed games made for it. I'm showing some here, but these are just games that I enjoy. I think the 6th generation was undoubtedly the worst when it came to the oversaturation of games made to capitalize on a popular IP. You would not believe what companies were willing to put out unless you were there living it. That being said, some of them were actually pretty good, including a few that we'll be talking about through the rest of this video. We'd be here forever if we talked about games based on cartoons, TV shows, and movies, though. I mean, there's a Fight Club game on PS2 for God's sake. Instead, I want to pivot here and focus on licensed games that I genuinely wanted to talk about when it comes to the PS2 specifically. Most of these licensed games I've shown are multi-platform, but these next few games were not. When I was younger, I went through a phase of playing a ton of games based on anime. These accounted for most of the licensed games I played on PS2, and as I've said, they're exclusive, so they contribute to my discussion of the system's massive library. Perhaps one of the most famous PS2 games to be based on an anime was the Dragon Ball Z Budokai series. Though the first 2 games were released on GameCube as well, which is where I first played them, Budokai 3 was exclusively released on PS2, and it is by far my favorite. On top of building on the systems of the previous games, it also had an insane amount of replayability through its multiple storylines, its unlockable characters, its custom builds, which could be shared online and fought via codes, and so much more. As a fighting game too, it was super accessible and offered a surprising and at times unintended amount of depth. Dragon Ball had a substantial presence on the PS2, right up to the console's twilight years, and we'll touch on that more when we get there. There were also plenty of other weird games based on anime. Cowboy Bebop received a game which has just received an English patch, by the way. Inuyasha received both an RPG and a fighting game. One Piece received multiple games, and Astro Boy's 2003 anime adaptation received a game developed by Sonic Team of all people. And just like their output in the mid to late 2000s, it was largely a mixed bag. Okay, that was a low-hanging fruit, whatever. For one thing, it is just as butchered as the English dub of the anime with a completely different soundtrack to match the dub, except for when Astro receives a new upgrade where it inexplicably uses the orchestral music from the Japanese version. And most of the game is a sluggish mess, with the exception of the boss fights, which I remember being tons of fun and easily the highlights of the whole game. It's too bad they only make up a fraction of your playtime, with the rest of it being awkward flying segments. Even though I didn't like the game much, it's not as bad as Evangelion had it though, because by some sick twist of fate, even that series received a few PS2 games, including a pachinko game where you just play pachinko. That's it. You don't earn anything because it's not a real machine. All you do is sit there and watch. I think we're at the bottom of the barrel here. Let me climb back out. The point is, no publisher could resist milking their intellectual properties. To close this segment out, I want to talk about a few adaptations that I found particularly interesting. Full Metal Alchemist also received a few games on the PS2. To this day, FMA is one of my favorite manga and TV shows of all time, easily transcending its shonen demographic, thanks to its philosophical themes and its exceptional portrayal of brotherhood. My brother and I relate to Ed and Al on a very personal level. Naturally, of course I was excited to play a game based on this series, and these games weren't fighting games, so they had more freedom to experiment. The first game, Broken Angel, is terrible, don't bother. But Curse of the Crimson Elixir is a little more interesting. It starts out exactly as the 2003 anime does, with Ed and Al meeting Rose and Father Cornello, but it diverges pretty strangely with these goopy monsters slithering around. Then again, the 2003 anime diverged as well, and it was still a good adaptation. In fact, I'd argue it did specific things better than Brotherhood, even if the second half didn't come close to rivaling the manga, or Brotherhood in the end. Either way, I was interested to see what they did. Sadly, it was all for the sake of the game having an original story. Nothing about it will sit with you. I mean, Sho Tucker is already dead by the time you're supposed to meet him. That's what we're talking about here. It's a prequel to the first game's story, which I also don't remember much of. That being said, the alchemy system is pretty creative, and building combos with it can be cool, as high combos grant experience bonuses. I love transmuting a rock wall and then lobbing bombs at enemies while using it as cover, or sucking enemies in and hitting them all at once. I've also accidentally hit Al with these boulders. I feel bad, but it was pretty funny when it happened. Cooperation between Ed and Al is also a big part of the gameplay here, and the interactions are on point in this game. There were definitely things about Crimson Elixir that carried my interest. It's not amazing, but it is immensely charming. Unfortunately, Fullmetal Alchemist is too heavy for them to build an action RPG with this structure without the game constantly interrupting itself with dialogue to convey the story's philosophical themes, which, to be fair, it kind of already does. The Sho Tucker storyline isn't really in this game because the team likely knew it just wouldn't work if constantly interrupted with gameplay moments. Berserk's PS2 game kind of has that same problem. There are a lot of long stretches where you just slash through enemies mindlessly. It dilutes the feeling of swinging Guts' Dragon Slayer around. You know, one of the most important visual elements of the series that makes it so much fun to read and watch. And Lord knows Berserk isn't always a fun read, and I say that endearingly. It's not as bad about watering things down as Berserk Muso, though, where Guts slaughters so many enemies that it's like the one scene where he battles 100 men in the forest over and over again. The thing is, when this Berserk PS2 game is good, it's really damn good. As a sequel to the awkward Dreamcast Berserk game, it is a massive improvement in virtually every way. The simple act of cutting things up in this game feels so fluid and dynamic. Guts' sword swings change their direction with fluidity depending on your position, which way you swing, and where your enemy is, making slicing things up feel indescribably satisfying. And the boss battles, oh man, I lived for the highs in this game. The lows are pretty damn low, but I pushed through and I'm kind of glad I did. Blood Will Tell is another awkward adaptation that is almost great, but not quite. Some of you might have heard of this game due to the fact that it goes for ridiculous amounts these days. For context, this game is an adaptation of Osamu Tezuka's manga Dororo, which focuses on Hyakimaru, a wandering ronin who was born blind, deaf, and without a face, limbs, vocal cords, or most of his internal organs due to a pact his father Kagemitsu Daigo made with 48 demons. Now a young man, he aims to reclaim his body by slaying each demon. Though it uses the same structure a lot of these anime adaptations use, specifically the ones that aren't fighting games, it is quite faithful, even starting with a tutorial where the player controlling Hyakimaru isn't able to see or hear properly. Now that's clever. The fascinating thing about this game is that much like Hyakimaru's journey in the manga, the more body parts you reclaim, the more bearable the game becomes, and you grow more capable as a samurai the further you get into it. That friction proves to be necessary as an adaptation of Dororo, and it's kind of brilliant, but ultimately, the gameplay wasn't compelling enough to hold my attention. Also, that English dub, man.
My voice. It's my own voice. I got my voice back.
Now for the games I spent the most time on. If you were living under a rock in the 2000s, you might not remember this, but when Naruto began airing over here, it quickly became a cultural phenomenon, and I was just the right age to be sucked into it. These days I don't care nearly as much, but truthfully, I think both Part 1 and Part 2 of Naruto can be pretty endearing at times. After the Pain arc, I lost all interest, but Naruto remains a pillar of my childhood. There were so many Naruto games released in such a short time frame, but for this segment I want to focus on 2 games, and even if you don't care about Naruto, you might find this interesting. In 2003, the Clash of Ninja and the Ultimate Ninja series both began, the former on GameCube and Wii, and the latter on PlayStation 2, and they both competed to maintain the Naruto license. Regrettably, I did not talk about the Clash of Ninja series in my previous console retrospectives, as I found myself worried that no one would care, but I've since learned that I could, quote, talk about the origins of yellow socks, and people would still watch. And since we're talking about the breadth of the PS2 library, telling this story seems fitting. Clash of Ninja, or Gekito Ninja Taisen in Japan, remains one of my all-time favorite fighting games, and I'm dead serious about that. Developed by the same people behind Bloody Roar, it is deceptively simple through its use of 1 or 2 button strings, but it offers frenetic gameplay, accessible yet extremely satisfying combo building thanks to its chakra cancelling mechanic, and strategy through its substitution mechanic, which allows you to use 75% of your meter to escape a combo and counterattack, though your opponent can predict and otherwise bait your use of it and guard accordingly, much like Burst in Guilty Gear. Oh, and the music is kick-ass. Sadly though, the publishers of this series, Takara Tomy, would lose the license to Namco Bandai, as Ultimate Ninja was far more successful, and I can see why. The Clash of Ninja games lacked significant unlockable content for most of its run as a series, completely fumbled in its adaptation and presentation of the Naruto storyline, and it also didn't have nearly as much thought placed in its bonus modes. I mean, Ultimate Ninja 3 had a whole mode where you explore the Leaf Village as part of a contest, where you unlock characters, equip them with different techniques and level them up, and take them all on dates for ramen. Okay, there's no romance in this game, that'd be weird, but I still found this part of the game especially memorable. Ultimate Ninja's gameplay was essentially designed to be a fighting game for those that otherwise wouldn't play traditional fighting games, playing sort of like a platform fighter, with its combos and strings only requiring a single button and a directional input, though you can chain together strings with some clever setups if you'd like. It's easy enough for anyone to pick up and play, but your options in combat, including a substitution mechanic, items, and a wide assortment of techniques to use, give it more variety than you'd expect. There's also a massive roster in each game, even if the differences can often be marginal. CyberConnect 2 developed this game, and you might know them for Asura's Wrath, Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, the Dot Hack series, which I didn't get around to playing for this video sadly, and most famously the Ultimate Ninja Storm games. These were 3D adaptations of the PS2 Ultimate Ninja's gameplay, and they went on to become some of the best-selling fighting games of all time because of their unique focus and CC2's trademark ability to create memorable battles out of crucial moments from the story. Their penchant for adapting this story with gorgeous visuals and animation in the PS2 games fully flourished in the jump to the PS3, so as you can see, the choice was obvious for the rights holders. Though ultimately I hold a lot of nostalgia for the Ultimate Ninja games, especially Ultimate Ninja 3, and I relish the opportunity to talk about them in any capacity. It just goes to show that you can find gems on the PS2 in just about every corner, and I feel like everyone that owned a PS2 back in the day has that one obscure game that they obsessed over as a kid. That's really the point of talking about all of these goofy-ass games. The PS2 has so many games that everybody has their own stories to tell regarding the console, their own unique experiences to share. And that's part of why the console has endured in the public consciousness for so long. This was a huge year for the PS2 and for Sony altogether. I might as well get the big one out of the way first. The best-selling game on the PS2, it forever changed the way games would be built and told an impactful story far beyond its predecessors in sophistication. It left an immeasurable impact, and to this day, there's nothing quite like it.
The Bouncer.
Set in the 1990s and inspired by real-life periods of civil unrest and gang rivalry, San Andreas follows Carl Johnson, who returns home from Liberty City in the wake of his mother's death. You play as CJ as he aims to stick by his family and friends, while Officer Tenpenny breathes down his neck, though events throughout the story force him into other cities, and he gets a taste of what life is like beyond Grove Street, further reinforcing the same reasons he ran to Liberty City in the first place. It is a story of corruption through both power and escapism, and a story about how fragile life can be. But it is also a story about family. It is far more intricately written than the previous games, and each area of the map serves to heighten the atmosphere of each phase of the story, with the topography and overall map design offering different methods of interacting with the game, and those methods are interwoven into the game's mission design. Speaking of which, San Andreas' world is unfathomably, impossibly massive for a PS2 game. This game feels like it was crafted for a console generation that hadn't arrived yet, and yet it managed to be crammed into the PS2. Also, to enhance your investment in the game world, you can level up stats throughout the game by performing certain actions consistently. Kind of like the Elder Scrolls now that I think about it. You can help Grove Street regain turf and collect revenue from that, as well as other ventures CJ takes over throughout the game, just to help you pay for weapons and ammo among other things, like my ever-changing wardrobe. It is by far the most customizable, freeing, and profound game of the PS2 trilogy, and on top of that, it has multiplayer free roam through some technical wizardry. You can even ride on top of any car, something that future GTA games do not let you do. Bless this goofy PS2 engine. Through all of the wacky things you can do in this game, including the things you can do when entering cheat codes, San Andreas created countless memories for those that played it, including me. And I only played through the story very recently. That should tell you just how truly magical these worlds were to mess around in. Through what I've said, you might think that I consider San Andreas the pinnacle of the series and an open world design on the PS2. But in truth, it's not actually my favorite open world game of this generation. That distinction belongs to Spider-Man 2. While not the largest world on the PS2, nor are its missions always refined or remarkable, it remains one of my favorite attempts at an open world game because everything you do is tied to your mastery over Spider-Man's abilities. Progression through the main game, collecting hero points by clearing side missions, collecting tokens by finding secret areas, storming secret bases, scouring skyscrapers, and completing races and obstacle courses. All of this is contingent on your acclimation to the web-slinger's many tricks of the trade, and you can progress to each main mission by doing any or all of these various activities. These tricks are afforded to you via the most mechanically rich, stylish, and physics-driven swinging system a Spider-Man game has ever seen, even when considering the Insomniac games. I still firmly believe this. The entire game revolves around a set of abilities that are so fun to use. Spider-Man 2 made me a firm believer of the notion that an open world as a setting in a video game is all about how one utilizes it, which is why despite these games having forever changed the landscape for action-adventure games today, I hold no resentment for the open world concept. I know what is possible when you do it right, and it's why I so dearly love the games that nail it. Another big reason this was such a huge year for the PS2 was because of the release of Metal Gear Solid 3. Much like its predecessor, it too dealt with philosophical and socio-political themes, with Snake's perspective on his operation completely changing by the end. I always admired the game's unique way of highlighting just how ephemeral every battle, every war, every ally, and every enemy can be as politics change with the times, as demonstrated through the boss and Snake's roles in Operation Snake Eater. History is but a stage, and these characters are all fulfilling their roles in this play, no matter how they are perceived in the end. My absolute favorite part about MGS3, though, was its survivalist setting. It made for one hell of a stealth sandbox, and I think this was probably the first game in the series where I really started to get good at thinking about my options when approaching a situation. I sort of fumbled through the previous games, but 3's camo system, open-ended level design, and food system got me to interact with these games like never before. MGS cemented itself as a prime example of the artistic prowess of game design, even when it has moments like this. In fact, some would argue because of these moments. A sleeper hit from 2004 ended up being Katamari Damacy, which is easily one of the best games on the console full stop. You roll things up into a giant ball and turn those giant balls into stars in the sky. You'll start out with a Katamari the size of an eraser, eventually becoming as large as the planet itself, and the entire game is built around reaching that point, seeing new parts of the city, and going from a small bedroom to an entire country. Its sequel, We Love Katamari, was a sort of meta-narrative that was grateful for the support that the original game received, and it featured more varied objectives and its own story about the King of All Cosmos' troubled relationship with his father. These games are delightfully absurd and so incredibly easy to love. These two games are the only Katamari games to involve original creator Keita Takahashi, and for that reason, I believe they have the most heart and soul of any games in the series. They were designed out of a desire to create something completely distinct, yet appealing to virtually anyone, through a strong and innovative core concept. And the music is on another level. Fun fact, I've been trying to write a Katamari video since 2018. It still hasn't happened. One day. To conclude our discussion of 2004 PS2 games, Dragon Quest VIII. Though Dragon Quest is only just finding its footing in the West now, I consider this game to be the reason for that renaissance. After publishing Dragon Quest 1 through 4, and then 7 in English as Dragon Warrior, Enix would merge with Squaresoft to create Square Enix, meaning that the same company now owned two titans in the same genre. This meant that Dragon Quest VIII received the treatment it rightfully deserved when it was released overseas, complete with a very British English dub.
Cool, blimey!
As an aside, Dragon Quest is probably my favorite RPG series of all time, to the point where I just might love them on a Zelda level, and I do not say that lightly. It's hard to adequately explain why I love it so much, and as someone who writes about video games for a living, it is rare that I am left at a loss for words in articulating my love of something. I consider most of these games like classic adventure novels, and they comfort me like nothing else. Even in a game like Dragon Quest V, which follows the protagonist over decades of his life as he matures and becomes a husband and father, the stories are not usually thematically dense, but they are always to some extent emotionally affecting, and they never leave your mind. These worlds feel like home, and these characters feel like family. In the case of Dragon Quest VIII, it is a story of friendship, plain and simple, but it is told in such an endearing way that you'll come to love all of your traveling companions by the end. It is so unbelievably good at capturing your imagination and immersing you in its world, and I couldn't ask for a better escape. A big reason I love them so much is because they are structured in such a way that only a video game could pull off, sort of like Chrono Trigger's cause and effect driving the game's design and narrative. In 8, you spend most of the first act chasing Dual Magus so that King Trode can return to his human self again. Once you end up beating Dual Magus, you'll realize that your work is not yet done, and suddenly the whole world is open to you as you find an animal companion to travel with, and then a boat, and finally, a giant dazzling bird to ride on in a world that rivals San Andreas in size. Your perception of the world's scale gradually expands as you solve mysteries and help people throughout the adventure. And compared to other RPGs, Dragon Quest is incredible at conveying your own personal growth as well. Initial damage numbers are piddly, and this is done so that you can witness the full story of you going from killing slimes to eventually dealing 1000 damage from a max tension hit on a debuffed boss. Storytelling is interwoven with gameplay in a beautiful marriage that I've seen few RPGs pull off. Sadly, I have to be concise here for the sake of this video, but I have far more to say about Dragon Quest as a series. I promise we'll get there someday. This was to be the final year of the PS2 being Sony's dominant platform, as the PS3 was on the horizon. Because of this, Team Ico's next game had to be released this year, before Sony diverted their full attention to the PS3. Shadow of the Colossus follows Wander as he fights desperately and tirelessly to revive a girl he loves. He goes on a quest through a completely barren and dead land to slay 16 Colossi, scaling them and felling them no matter the cost that he or anyone else should face. The game is a powerful examination of grief and loss, illustrating the lengths one will go to just for one chance at things returning to the way they were. Shadow of the Colossus made me love games in an entirely new way. I actually don't know where I'd be today had this game not opened my eyes to what was possible in game design. The actual game part of it, finding ways to scale each of the colossi, managing your stamina, clinging to each one for dear life and plunging your sword into its weak points, is utterly brilliant. But much like Ico, it is impossible to separate its design from its storytelling. The two elements are always one and the same, which is a huge reason games can be so special to begin with. It was also a miracle of optimization. Due to the demanding nature of its gameplay and rendering the colossi in detail, the game's frame rate would drop below 20 FPS frequently. Much worse than Ocarina of Time's frame rate, at least that game was consistent. Even so, a game of this scope running on hardware from the year 2000 is a feat of technical witchcraft. Again, I am oversimplifying my feelings toward this game, and I have a whole retrospective about the works of Team Ico, if you'd like to learn more. 2005 would still end up being another slam dunk for the PS2. After Devil May Cry completely redefined character-driven action games, and DMC2 came out, director Hideaki Itsuno took up the helm and made Devil May Cry 3, one of the most stylish, rewarding, creative, and player-driven action games of all time.
This party's getting crazy.
It is designed to punish players until they can harness everything at Dante's disposal and keep that style meter up by any means necessary, ultimately making the game feel as though you've become a delectably stylish, unstoppable force. Another action game, God of War, released this year, and it too enabled player expression in its combos, though not nearly to the same extent. Still a fun game though. Okay, I shouldn't slight God of War like that. It was a great blend of elements from across multiple action-adventure games, being especially empowering thanks to how much control is afforded to you by its weapons. I imagine the Blades of Chaos were created to solve a problem in other action games where you have multiple enemies to deal with, but there's only one of you, and you can do some extraordinarily satisfying things with them. But then you also have the giant Blade of Artemis that turns you into guts from Berserk as you slice through individual enemies. And that's not even factoring in the possibilities with the magic you get from each god and Medusa's severed head. I do think some of the puzzles, enemies, and bosses are annoying, but the game still holds up. It's just difficult and unfair when I position it next to Devil May Cry. That being said, God of War would go on to become one of Sony's flagship franchises, as I'm sure you know, and we will return to it soon enough. As far as action games go, there's also one game that went for a more grounded, brutal, and cinematic approach to combat, and the franchise it would spawn would take a long time to be recognized in the West. I partially blame its English dub.
10 years in the joint made you a
Like a Dragon, or Yakuza as most people knew it in the West for many years, is a game series that can often pivot between serious drama and the silliest game you have ever played on a dime. And yet, its fluctuating tone is never a detriment to the experience at all. And the combat, while more grounded than other action games, is made special through discovering new heat actions and ways to mess enemies up, as well as attempting to find openings in your opponent's moveset, as if you're really having a one-on-one street fight. In Japan, the games received acclaim for their structure, storytelling, fidelity to their setting, and their depiction of the country's criminal underworld, which is hard to sell adequately in the West, though it eventually found its audience. Though I find the original Yakuza is a bit of a prototype for what the series would become, especially in terms of combat and side content, Yakuza 2 would iron out most of the first game's flaws, especially those two I just singled out. Even then, I enjoy both games a fair bit for different reasons. I'm specifically recommending you play these games instead of Kiwami and Kiwami 2, primarily because it is easier to transition into Yakuza 3 and onward when going from the PS2 games to the first PS3 game, instead of going from a souped-up Yakuza 0 and a Dragon Engine jank fest to the first PS3 game. And because I think the remakes scrub a lot of the gritty stylistic choices out of the original games, especially Yakuza 2. Redone voice acting, changes in atmosphere right down to color correction, and different music in key scenes, like Kiryu smoking by the river here, if you know you know, as well as an abundance of miscellaneous quests that make Kiwami 2 its own experience separate from the original. Just goes to show that you can tell a convincing story and build a great game, no matter the hardware. Changing gears a bit, let's talk about what is possibly my favorite platformer on the PS2 at the moment, Ape Escape 3. Though Ape Escape 2 came out on the PS2 as well, I've never owned it and I decided to play 3 first. I'm glad I did too, because Ape Escape 3 takes the tried and true formula of the previous games, catching apes with various gadgets, and throws transformations into the mix, as well as designing each level around films and TV shows, as if you were hopping between television channels. The transformations are one of the most exciting things about playing through this game for the first time, as they provide an entirely new way to interact with the levels, fight enemies, and smash stuff, as well as new ways to catch the apes themselves. Then, once you've finished the game once, you can go back and catch all of the apes you missed, as well as new ones, all while you can transform into a magical girl. Yeah, I know you can also play as Yumi's brother Kei, but Yumi is better. Oh, and after you've done all that, you can go for the time attack mode. It's rare that I decide to 100% complete games these days, but messing around in this game proved to be a ton of fun. The sheer creativity on display never ceased to amaze me. Oh, but excuse me, I've failed to mention the fact that there is a Metal Gear Solid game inside of Ape Escape 3 that was entirely supervised by Hideo Kojima, Metal Gear Solid. The name is an admittedly difficult pun to translate into English. In a game that has an overt Japanese flair, with Yumi being an idol that can turn into a magical girl, the general absurdity and variety in its gameplay, and the many Japanese puns and jokes in the names of individual monkeys, this is somehow the thing that is hardest to translate without butchering it entirely. It combines metaru, or metal, and saru, the Japanese word for monkey, into mesaru. I am dead serious about this. The stealth gameplay, the writing, the codec conversations, everything is here and accounted for, and it has some great lines.
Well, those Simian specialists who hang out here with you, I'd like to get their help.
I'd like to help you, but there's just one snag. You see, all of them, Spike, Jimmy, Kay, and Yumi, are at summer camp for their whole summer break, and they're getting back next week.
Summer camp? This is a national emergency.
Okay, I'm off to Colonel Campbell's place to report on the mission. What are you going to do now? Is that right? Well, I guess that's the way it goes. We'll probably meet again somewhere.
Please play Ape Escape 3. It is so good. Finally, and perhaps most impactfully on the video game industry, Guitar Hero began life this year on the PS2. Not a lot needs to be said about this game today, but what I find most lovable about the first game in the series is how endearing its humble origins were. The bonus features in the game delve into the fun process of creating each character to embody an era of rock, and these characters would later become icons of the franchise. The game stemmed from a genuine desire to make a fun arcade-like rhythm game that made non-musicians feel like they were playing the songs. It was purely psychological, but damn did it feel good. I have a video on the franchise that you can check out if you like, detailing its rise and fall. At the end of 2006, the PlayStation 3 was released. At launch, it had full backwards compatibility with both PS1 and PS2 games, but it was marred by questionable decisions on Sony's part and a lack of compelling launch games. The price was famously mocked and criticized, I guess history repeats itself evermore, and Resistance Fall of Man by Insomniac Games was probably the only game I can remember from the PS3 launch that I cared about. It would take a while for the PS3 to have major system sellers. Because of this, the PS2 continued to thrive for a few years after its successor launched. 2006 brought us another non-Grand Theft Auto Rockstar game, this time developed by Rockstar Vancouver, Bully. At Bulworth Academy, Jimmy Hopkins has to prove himself to the faculty and the students in various cliques around him in the hopes of eventually squashing the bullying problem at his school. Though Jimmy is a delinquent, he is still incredibly relatable due to his position when he arrives at Bulworth Academy, and the player is once again given a great deal of freedom as they would be in Grand Theft Auto, just in a high school context and without, the whole crime thing. Naturally, this caused controversy just as Rockstar's previous games did, but ultimately, the game was more so about Jimmy carving an identity out for himself at his school and gaining the respect of his peers. Sure, these were not always through the honorable, conventional means that teachers and parents hoped for us, where you stand up for yourself and talk them out of bullying you, or, you get their parents and teachers involved. But if you were ever bullied in school, you'd know that these are not permanent solutions and can only make the problems worse. Anyone who's been bullied knows that the ways Jimmy takes matters into his own hands are played for comedic effect and are not meant to be replicated. And the game never demands that you go on a rampage and bully random students around school, though if you decide to do that, it is pretty funny. And that's all it is meant to be. This game isn't creating new bullies or anything like that. In fact, I feel it could help victims of bullying in surprisingly profound ways. It certainly would have helped me just by giving me a reason to laugh about everything. The groups that attacked this game, without even playing it themselves, mind you, attacked it for unfounded reasons. Much like Rockstar's other games, it uniquely commentates on a facet of society through the interactive medium, and it does so while being incredibly entertaining. Also in 2006, the studio within Capcom that developed Beautiful Joe for the GameCube, Clover Studio, would release not one, but 2 games in the same year. The first I'm going to talk about is God Hand, a bizarre, brutally challenging but ultimately memorable and extremely customizable action game directed by Shinji Mikami of Resident Evil fame. I've never seen a game allow you to fully equip the character with individual moves, as well as build entire combos out of those moves and upgrade the amount of moves you can have in a combo. And those combos? You can juggle enemies effortlessly like you're playing Tekken or something. Leave it to Clover to come up with something like this. The other game was Okami, directed by Hideki Kamiya of the original Devil May Cry. Now, admittedly, I still haven't finished this game, but what I did play of it convinced me of its beauty, and not just because of its incredibly well-realized art style. I know the higher resolutions in Okami HD make it seem like it could have been released on the PS3, but it wasn't initially. It was a 2006 PlayStation 2 game, which is almost unbelievable. For one thing, its design takes after The Legend of Zelda, and that gives players a lot of freedom to dig into everything they've created, from puzzles to dungeons to exploration to side quests and beyond, all with an identity of its own through the setting inspired by Japanese folklore. The game is an absolute delight to exist in, and I really only think I got a taste of what is possible in it. Writing about it makes me realize how badly I want to go back and finally complete the journey. I think as a fan of Zelda, I owe it to myself to see how Kamiya and his team at Clover interpreted the series' strengths and brought their own spin to it. My favorite PS2 game from 2006, at least of the ones I've finished, just to exclude Okami from this list for now, was undoubtedly Persona 3. From the moment the game begins to the moment it concludes, the game is a balancing act, and a grim reminder of your mortality hangs over the entire game. Everything you do feeds into your time exploring Tartarus, but you can't spend too much time outside of Tartarus, as you'll need to make your way to the top of each block before the next full moon so that you are sufficiently prepared for that night's boss fight. Because of this, your actions will all have to have meaning with each passing day, and it is haunting yet nostalgic and warm. I love this game, I love these characters, and though I am quite sick of how repetitive Tartarus can get, I don't regret how I spent my time in the slightest. I have a video on Persona 3, 4, and 5 that you can check out if you'd like to know more of my thoughts. Although I'd like to make an amendment to the Persona 3 segment of that video. Chihiro is not really my type anymore. Honestly, I wish there was a romance route for Elizabeth. Sorry, Romace. I still can't believe I did that 3 times without noticing it. The true indicator of the system's enduring appeal came when God of War 2 hit shelves. Even after the PS3's launch, God of War 2 was a huge success. I still haven't finished it, but from what I've played, I can say that it is an improvement over the first game in many ways, and an absolute triumph that demonstrated the PS2 still very much had life left in it. It is so much fun, and a spectacle that few PS2 action games could ever truly achieve. Much like San Andreas or Shadow of the Colossus, it felt like a game made for the 7th generation of consoles. And though it had arrived, it was built for a console that was aging fast, but not at all ready to tap out. Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3 also technically released on the Wii in 2007, but I figured a lot of people played on PS2, so I figure it's worth mentioning here. I couldn't really think of a more comprehensive game that showcases the electrifying battles of Dragon Ball. Once you acclimate to the controls, the sense of scale, level of destruction, the combo potential across the massive levels, the multitude of offensive and defensive options, and the speed at which the game can move all emulate the feeling of watching those battles take place in the anime staggeringly well, in addition to enabling a power fantasy and dream matchups like Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta versus Oolong. Oh, Oolong's not playable? Well, now I hate this game. Lastly, let's talk about a developer that truly found their footing on the PlayStation 2, even if their games arrived as late as this. Odin's Sphere was developed by Vanillaware as a spiritual successor to the Sega Saturn game Princess Crown. They were both directed by the same person, too. Technically, I'm playing the PS3 port, which revises certain gameplay elements to play more like Muramasa, another Vanillaware game, but that's okay, because I absolutely love their games from what I've played of them. Each of their games have this distinct, gorgeous hand-drawn look to them, and their takes on side-scrolling action, strategy, and role-playing games are all usually revered, and for good reason. I consider them to be like treasure when it comes to 2D action games, and I'd honestly say that Vanillaware being around today is thanks to the PS2 and its massive install base hungry for unique and creative games. Admittedly, there were so many more games I wanted to talk about in this video that are strange and obscure, but I wasn't able to fit them into the timeline. Let me rapid fire through a few of them. First, Mr. Mosquito, the best game ever made. Oh, how quickly a mosquito's life can end. This is a game that places you in the shoes of a mosquito, and you must use stealth and clever problem solving to your advantage in order to drink the blood of your victims. You will value your life just as a mosquito should, as it can quickly be snuffed out if you are not paying attention to your surroundings. If there's one critique I have of the game, it's that its controls are a bit unwieldy. Oh, and the fact that male mosquitoes don't drink blood. Have you ever played Tulip? You go around kissing people, and it's surprisingly a lovely game. It is also one of the weirdest games I have ever played in my life. Another game I played often with my cousin was War of the Monsters, which let you play as an assortment of completely original kaiju and battle while destroying the city underneath you. It's a power fantasy for sure. Speaking of treasures, since I mentioned them earlier, they actually made a 3D game for the PS2, which is rare for them. It was called Stretch Panic. I haven't finished it, but I remember what I played of it being very strange indeed. Disgaea has a cult following of its own. I picked this game up because I had an itch for tactics gameplay, but I think I was more swayed by the cute character designs and because it was dirt cheap. Okay, mostly because it was dirt cheap. Also, check out the back of the box. Strategy RPGs are about to get a serious kick in the ass. Written in papyrus too, good god. Once you get accustomed to building your party, all of the optional mechanics, the stats, securing votes at the Senate, by god, there's a lot to consider, but once you get accustomed to all of that, if you like Fire Emblem's tactical gameplay and Dragon Quest's vocation system, then this game will feel like home as you control all of these units and you have a great deal of freedom and control as you progress through the game on your own terms. Plus, the game can be pretty cute. Did I mention these characters are cute? Really, the biggest problem I had in making this video was that I simply did not have time to play everything that I wanted to play. I missed out on a lot, but again, that is just a huge testament to the PS2's positively enormous library that you could play through for years and years. For a full list of the games I included in this video, as well as the games that I wanted to play but couldn't, check the link in the description below. Even in 2008 and beyond, the PS2 still had legendary games in the pipeline. Persona 4 is the game I consider to be the PS2's swan song, and personally, one of my all-time favorite RPGs. Again, I have a video you can watch to learn more about how they impacted me. Much like Persona 3, you have to use your time wisely, but its small-town setting made escaping to this world feel incredibly close to home for me. It was uplifting and it reminded me of simpler times, just as writing this video did. It really drove home how valuable our time on this planet truly is, and we'll revisit that notion quite soon. The PS2's life would not end for quite a while though, even after that game. My most distinct memory from this phase of the console's life, at least relating to new games, was seeing that they made a PS2 version of Toy Story 3 in 2010 while I was at Walmart. The toy box mode that allows players to build up, explore, and customize their own little hub world had been entirely excluded, and that was the reason I even gave a damn about the game at the time, so it was a bizarre thing to find. Even then I thought it was a strange decision to make a PS2 game that late in the console's life. But then again, there I was, staring at a brand new PS2 game 10 years after the console's launch. At the time, I was close to adolescence. When the PS2 came out, I still needed a high chair. The console had been around for almost my entire life, and it was still kicking. I think I must have felt comforted somehow by that notion. At the end of 2005, Sony released the PlayStation Portable in Japan, featuring a wide assortment of multimedia functionality when compared to the Nintendo DS. And it had enough power that certain PS2 games were actually ported to it, while the PS2's install base and similar architecture meant that PSP games would come to PS2 as well, even long after the PS3 took over. With games like Liberty City Stories in 2006, Vice City Stories in 2007, Silent Hill Origins in 2008, Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier in 2009, and Siphon Filter Logan's Shadow in 2010, 3 years after its release on PSP. The install base for the PS2 was so large that ignoring it entirely, even in this new generation, would be the wrong move. The PlayStation Vita would succeed the PSP in 2012, and with it came a slew of new games and features: Gravity Rush, Tearaway, and nearly every single Vanillaware game. Despite releasing what was essentially an 8th generation handheld console on the cusp of the launch of the Wii U, PS4, and Xbox One, PlayStation 2 consoles were still being produced in 2012. People were still buying them, and PS2 games continued to be made. If anyone has any memories of late PS2 games from between 2007 to 2013, I encourage you to sound off in the comments. There are just too many games for me to talk about in this video, and I'm curious. The end of the PlayStation 2 would finally arrive in 2013. A couple of months prior, Sony ceased production of PS2 consoles in Japan, and it was discontinued worldwide on January 4th, 2013. A month later, Sony revealed the PlayStation 4. The console almost stayed on the market long enough to see 2 of its successors. The last PlayStation 2 game ever released was Pro Evolution Soccer 2014, which was released on November 8th, 2013 in Europe, only a week before the PlayStation 4's North American launch. And by that point, I was in high school. Despite this, support for existing online-compatible games continued well into the 2010s. In fact, Final Fantasy XI expansions continued to release on PS2, and its servers were officially supported until March 2016, a year before the Nintendo Switch came out. The game is still online today on PC, by the way, with its most recent episodic expansion releasing from 2020 to 2023. So far, my console retrospectives tend to tell of a rise and fall for the system in question. The GameCube failed toward the end of its life. The Wii and Nintendo DS lost relevance as the world adopted smartphones and other means of casual gaming. That simply did not happen with the PlayStation 2. Even as the PS3 succeeded, it lived on. It lived and died a success by every conceivable metric, and faded away naturally as technology evolved. The only real tragedy in this story is the passage of time. At the beginning of the PS2's life, I was still not yet cognizant, and by the time the final PS2 online server shut down with Final Fantasy XI, I was about to become a legal adult. The PS2 was around for basically the entirety of my childhood, and because I continue to play PS2 games regularly that are entirely new to me, it is still alive in my eyes. The PlayStation 2 was on the market for 13 years. Kitten, that was in the video of the North American PS2 launch, lived an entire life, possibly about as long as the PS2 was being sold. All of those towers that have accumulated in the background of the PlayStation 2's startup are an indication of just how much time has passed, and all of the experiences you've had in that time. Today, indie games have been a tremendous help in filling the void that the PS2 left. It's a facet of the medium that doesn't require publisher approval or implementation of industry trends. It's just people making exactly the kinds of games that they want to make. Everyone who experienced this era continues to want more abstract ideas and creative thinking. And now, there's plenty of games to discover that embody the trailblazing and creativity of the PS2. That's why, although I very much miss those days, I don't want to drone on about how great things used to be. As long as there are people who desire to make things, the human creative spirit will endure. What I was truly reminded of in making this video is to cherish every single day as it comes, because that time will escape you before you know it. Which brings me to my final PS2 game of this video, and the one that I think embodies everything I discussed. Boku no Natsuyasumi 2. A sequel to the Japanese PS1 game, Boku follows the eponymous boy through his summer vacation at his aunt and uncle's house in 1975. Despite its setting not being one that Japanese kids in the Heisei era were nostalgic for, its transience, storytelling, and its ability to encourage players to spend their time wisely all proved to be timeless qualities that transcended the era it was depicting. As for me, I spent my summer in a country I didn't grow up in an era I wasn't alive in a PS2 game that English-speaking territories never received. And truth be told, it was the summer that taught me to value my time most of all. When Boku arrives on the island, he doesn't know his cousins very well at all, and he isn't able to completely match their energy. He also runs into a few other characters along the way, but it doesn't initially help you feel at home. It's easy to relate to Boku as he gets a lay of the land walking around the island for the first time. As you do, you'll learn about catching bugs and partaking in beetle sumo with your cousins. You might meet the doctor up the hill, or meet his granddaughter Yasuko, or stumble upon the empty house just down the path, or learn to fish from your uncle, or go swimming in the ocean looking for bottle caps. While doing these things, you'll gradually acclimate yourself to the layout of the island, as well as the people that live there. It feels a bit more welcoming, and you're excited to see what the next day brings. I distinctly remember when I was convinced I was in for one of my favorite games of all time. One morning, early in my vacation, I awoke to join Yasuko for a walk around the island. I was able to soak in a lot of the gorgeous pre-rendered backgrounds that looked as though they had leapt from a painting, and these backgrounds all have gorgeous alternate lighting setups depending on the time of day, as well as the excellent cinematography that packed in and emphasized a lot of the detail in each scene, while also capturing the wistful melancholy of the island and the brevity of your time here. That's just what I admire from a visual standpoint. From a narrative and gameplay standpoint, things changed after this walk through the island. Yasuko and the boy that lives in that empty house, Yo, seem to have some history and won't talk to one another, and that gives you one of a few emotional hooks to work towards as you spend each day on the island. Then, and perhaps most crucially, I went out at night for the first time, and while walking up to Yasuko's house, I heard music. Gymnopédie No. 1 by Eric Satie to be exact, playing on the record player in Yasuko's house. From here I learned about how these records belonged to her late father, and how she hasn't spoken to her mother in a long time. It was then I knew that I wanted to do everything in my power to bring these people back together again. For every single story in this game, I followed the clues from each of the people I talked to in order to solve their problems. I visited Yasuko's younger sister to build a schedule for each of my days, and planned out when and how I was going to help them out and see how each arc would resolve. Simply put, life is too short to have regrets. And without spoiling anything else regarding this game's events, this island conveyed this through simple but extremely effective means, with surprises throughout that kept me in love with the island. At no point is it mandatory to do anything in this game. It is up to you to decide how you want to use your time before you have to leave. For each day, Boku will write something in his journal to commemorate what you did, but even if you aren't able to do something especially important that day, instead focusing on other various activities, Boku will still write that it was a great day. In fact, there is so much to discover and do in this game that on a single playthrough, it is sadly impossible to see everything, which is why you have to cherish every day and spend them wisely. If that sounds stressful, I promise you it isn't. Boku 2 is one of the most relaxing games I have ever played. If you pack each day with things to remember, you'll not only realize just how fast time passes, but also how much you'll miss that time once you've spent it all. The final evening on the island is bittersweet. Despite doing everything that I'd wanted to do, I was not ready to leave. Much like the summer camps of my youth, this island felt like home to me. No matter if you spend a week, a month, or a year doing something, visiting someplace, or being with someone, if it left as profound an impact as this island did on me, by the time you have to leave it behind, it'll hurt all the same. We never realize how cruel the passage of time can be until that time has escaped us. Instead, it's important to stop and watch the waves every once in a while. It's important to value each day as it comes your way. Boku 2 is everything that I discussed in this video. It utilizes the uniqueness of this art form to convey a message, a staple of the PS2's best games. It is a representation of the vastness of the PS2 library, as the game was only widely known in Japan, and it remains incredibly niche elsewhere. It is a representation of how I am still finding new PS2 games to this day, and I probably will continue to do so until I die. But most of all, even though I tend to wistfully reflect on my youth, a bygone era of simpler times, it is not terribly productive to just sit and dwell on lost time. Instead, it is important to learn from the time that has passed, be proactive, and continue to cherish everything that comes your way in life. Though the series was famously only released in Japan, a fan translation by Hilltop was created in 2023, marking the first time the series had been made playable in English. I actually interviewed Hilltop for this video, just so I could gain some insight into the process of creating the English patch, and I learned a lot from our conversation. While playing the game, it was clear to me that this was a professional-grade localization, with a script that was faithful to the original intent, while also being readable and easily digestible in English. It wasn't enough to just translate the script, which is massive on its own, mind you, but Hilltop and the team also made assembly-level modifications to the game's code, so that the Japanese text read vertically on the side of the screen could be read from left to right on the bottom of the screen when translated into English. The same goes for Boku's journal entries, as well as his handwriting next to the drawings. Oh, and those subtitles that appear in the final scene on the beach? Those did not exist in the base version of the game. They were programmed specifically for the English version. Same goes for the subtitles in Beatles Sumo, if you can believe it. Hilltop also provided me with some examples of textures that the team had to manually translate, while also maintaining the style of the original Japanese lettering. As you can see, this stuff is beyond a mere translation of the menus. It is as though the game truly did come out in English back in 2002. I want to give a huge thanks to Hilltop for graciously allowing me to interview him, as well as extend a huge thanks to him and the rest of the team for their incredible work on the English patch. Provided you already have a copy of the game, like I do, you can download the patch and play Boku 2 in English from Hilltop's Patreon for free. Here's to the PlayStation 2, and to the time that slipped through our fingers. Here's hoping that I can continue to live every day with purpose from here on out. Before I close this whole thing out, Boku 2 is a Japanese game, right? It was region-locked worldwide. Even though it was a physical sort of region lock, digital region locking is a practice that persists to this day. In fact, it's getting worse. You might be able to see where I'm going with this, but trust me, I have a lot of respect for these folks. This video has been graciously sponsored by the legendary Surfshark VPN, which specializes in allowing you to access content restricted or otherwise unavailable in your country by offering 3,200 servers from 100 countries and protecting your data on public Wi-Fi. In an age where digital censorship is becoming increasingly more prevalent, I use Surfshark almost every day. So yeah, it's a VPN, you've heard about them. But Surfshark is my go-to thanks to its industry-leading WireGuard protocol, IP rotator, and its strict no-logs policy, which means that Surfshark does not keep track of what you do while using its service. It really puts the private in virtual private network, doesn't it? They also offer other products such as Surfshark Antivirus for protecting your devices from malware and other threats, Surfshark Alert for notifying you if your passwords are found in a breach, and even Alternative ID for masking your real name and contact info online. Surfshark is also extremely kind and lenient with one of my favorite channels on YouTube, Tomska and Friends, allowing them to make some wild integrations in their videos and even financing certain projects. Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee if you're not satisfied, so if you'd like to try it out, go to surfshark.com/Triforce or use code Triforce at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. You heard that right, 4 additional months for free. With that, I've been Liam Triforce. Thanks for watching.
The Bouncer.